uninvited guests on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jonathan Foley. I've known John for nearly 30 years. It'll be 30 years next year. John was my PhD supervisor and is a good friend and mentor. He has connections to other IRES faculty. He was also Simon Donner's PhD supervisor. He was also the director of the institute where Layla Harris started her career as an academic. And many of you collaborated with him over the years. I'm delighted to have him here. John is the executive director of Project Drawdown. You'll hear more about it during his talk. But he started his career as an academic. He was a professor first at the University of Wisconsin and later at the University of Minnesota, where he founded and led several well-known international research institutes. He's internationally recognized for his work in climate science, vegetation modeling, land use, and food systems. In 2014, he quit academia and went to lead the California Academy of Sciences, a really well-known museum, where he really immersed himself in kind of public education for 4 years. Then he left California, and he's now been working with Project Drawdown, essentially helping institutions around the world reduce their climate footprint. Please join me in welcoming John.
Well, thank you, Naveed. I was going to say for the very kind introduction until you mentioned the 30 years part. And I'm like, I'm going to debate the mathematics of that. If it's 30 years, that means I'm like, oh, no, that's just, that can't possibly be right, but I'm afraid it is. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me at UBC. It's really a pleasure to be here amongst so many great people and friends and folks doing amazing work here. I was asked to, I wanted to give a presentation about climate solutions and how we can think about the climate crisis. Obviously, we're all going to think about this a little bit differently. This is just one perspective, and I'd love to have a really great broad-ranging conversation later. So I can't wait for the questions and conversation a little after these slides. But this year has been tough, hasn't it? We've been seeing unbelievable images of what a warming planet is starting to look like. Certainly here in Canada, seeing the incredible fires we've experienced here, which have transformed the whole hemisphere, not just your nation, but the world, as well as shattered records of temperatures and extreme events all over the world. And it'd be very, very easy right now to be quite despondent about climate change, of course, absolutely. It's serious, it's getting pretty bad, and it would be very, very understandable to feel kind of lost and a little grief-stricken right now. I certainly do. But I remind myself that history has always been a race. It's been a race between two very different futures. The world has always been going to hell and getting better at the same time. And here we are again. This has always been true, and it's true again today, but maybe in a different way. And the two futures we're facing now, though, of course, are very different than before, but they look something like this. One is where we get it wrong. We don't stop the climate crisis in time to avert the worst of the damage. And we take it head on. It gets bad, really bad. And it hurts the most vulnerable people first and most, along with critical planetary systems, resources, economies, you name it. This is a world we do not want, but it's one we could still be headed to if we're not careful. But the world we want to get to, I think, is this one, where we stop climate change from getting to the very worst outcomes. We still have some. It's already here, no question, but we avert the worst of it. And in doing so, which is the great news, not only do we stop a really bad thing from happening, we end up building a better world than we've ever had in the process. That's kind of a bonus. That's the world I want. I think it's the world you want. I think it's the world we should kind of be striving for. So if we're in a race between these two very different futures, I think we can still win it and get to that second outcome. But there are a few things standing in the way. Right now, we're kind of stuck from winning that race in a flat finish. Why are we stuck? Well, one reason is we are confused. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of confusion out there. But what should we do? How do we figure it out? What should we do to stop this crisis? What's the best path forward? We'll talk about that. We're also being held up by people who want to hold up action, who are deliberately trying to delay action to distract us, mainly for profit or for power, whatever. But there are kind of bad actors in the system who are trying to slow us down. So we're confused and being deliberately held back at the same time. And then third, what we want to talk about a little bit, of course, is we are human beings after all. And I feel it, probably you do too. There are going to be moments where you feel like giving up. There are going to be moments of doubt and despair, or like, what the hell, throw in the towel, forget it. Well, we have to process those emotions and I think move through them to the other side where we get back to work. Because a pessimist is always right about their own future, but we don't have to be pessimist. We can be conditional optimist and see if we can change the world. So how are we going to do this? Well, I think we can still build a better future. And what I want to talk to you today about is 3 ways we can move forward, the 3 things we need. The first thing we need, I'm a scientist, not all of you are, but I think we can agree science is sometimes helpful. And I think science has something to contribute to addressing this crisis. So I'm going to say we do need science. Not the only thing we need a lot more, but we do need science to guide us out of this incredible crisis. And when I think about scientists saving the world, I think about Matt Damon. And maybe you do too, I don't know, that's what comes to mind. And I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, The Martian, where Matt Damon plays a guy stranded on Mars. Happens to be a scientist, he's a botanist, and Mark Watney. He's left behind on Mars all by himself and he has to figure out how to survive. And he uses science to do it. And I love this quote of his character. He says, you just begin, you do the math, you solve one problem, then you solve the next one, and then the next. And the best line in any movie ever, in my opinion, is, we only have one option. We're gonna have to science the shit out of this, okay? I think the same thing's true with climate change. We're gonna have to science the blank out of this. We're gonna have to figure out what works and what doesn't, and use science as a tool to guide us towards the better outcome. So let's see if we can figure that out. Because science has helped. It has first identified the problem, right? If it weren't for science, we wouldn't know why the planet seemed to be getting warmer. In fact, we probably wouldn't even know it was getting warmer. We just know something seems weird. But in fact, science has told us it is getting warmer and it's told us why. And it told us that a long time ago. When I was a grad student back in the Pleistocene, I was told there's a guy named Joseph Tyndall first discovered the idea of climate change. Well, it turns out that was not true. It was actually an American woman named Eunice Foote who published in the 1850s the first paper ever showing that increasing levels of CO2 would warm the planet. Well, as a woman scientist in the 19th century, she did not get appropriate credit for her work. It was largely ignored and only rediscovered basically in the last, 10 to 20 years. So I hope your textbooks and your professors are mentioning Eunice. She was the first person to get us on this line of thinking. Joseph Tyndall did not. In fact, he was killed by his wife a few years later. Ironically, just totally ironic. I don't know what, interesting factoid. I don't know what that means. So science helped us figure out the problem. Maybe it can help us figure out solutions too, because wow, do we need help? Now that climate change has captured the imagination and the economy and the political discourse of our nations, there's money to be made out here now. There's power to be made. There's fame to be made. So everybody and their brother is going to pitch you their favorite climate solution and try to sell them to you. So go on Facebook and ask, how do I solve the climate crisis? You'll get very confident people who know absolutely nothing, by the way, who are very confident in telling you, I have the silver bullet. I have the solution with a capital T to climate change. And they're probably going to look something like this, or some random list of silver bullet solutions, none of which are actually the right answer. There is no right answer. There is no silver bullet. There's only silver buckshot. We're going to have to do a lot of things. And we're going to have to avoid the hype and the greenwashing and figure out what's actually effective. Well, fortunately, science can help us do that and get back on track. For example, we can do what we call a meta-analysis. A lot of you have done these too. The idea of a meta-analysis is it's kind of a study of all the studies. What does the collective knowledge of the entire community of scientists and engineers and everybody else out there say about a particular climate solution? So that's something we've been doing for the last few years, is doing a meta-analysis around different climate solutions. These are the solutions we've analyzed in electricity, for example, showing that when you look at all the data, all the spread of the data, we ask how effective is the solution in terms of mitigating carbon emissions? How big could it be? How scalable is it? And finally, how expensive is it? What would it cost to do that? And we find a lot of viable solutions like wind and solar and hydro and some nuclear and stuff like that. They're all on this list, as well as energy efficiency and conservation. Absolutely. These are viable, ready to go. We endorse them. We say they're ready to go. Notice there are a few things not on that list, like fusion. Nope, not ready, not even close. Won't be for years, maybe ever. So we don't include it. There's no data to support it's actually being a solution yet. Or advanced nuclear, nope, been promised for 40 years, still in the lab, nope, not a solution yet. We mean a solution is something in the world actually working today that has evidence from a third party verifying its effectiveness. So that's what we look at. There are food solutions, there are transportation solutions, and then we have the whole gamut. And here, there's about 100 or so solutions that we've analyzed that we think, yep, that's effective. This is a tool that can actually address climate change. And the size of those little wedges is proportional to how big we think it could be in the long run. We update this every year or two, and it's pretty helpful. But the thing that's really good to have something like this, and others do this too, other groups can do that, not just us, but that we have an evidence base for what works. In other words, kind of a BS detector. When somebody says, oh, this is the silver bullet for climate change, and then you say, well, is there any evidence that it works? So, carbon capture? No, it's not on this list. Fusion? No, it's not. But what is on the list, and a lot of very good things. And the good news is we have a lot of them. So there's an evidence base for solutions, and we can follow it. We can also look at the basic economics of climate solutions. And this is where we like to build things called cost curves, where you stack up the price of climate solutions from the cheapest on the left to the most expensive on the right. Now, this is what's called a net cost curve, where we compare the cost of climate solutions to a world where we don't use climate solutions. We keep powering the world with fossil fuels and industrial pollution and unsustainable agriculture. So this is looking at a world where we implement climate solutions versus a world where we don't. The good news is, in the long run, over 30 years or so, the climate solutions world is 80% of the time cheaper than the world we have now. It's actually just cheaper to build that world and cheaper to run it than the world we have today. That's incredibly good news. It defangs one of the biggest critiques of doing anything about climate change, is that it's too expensive. Well, not in the long run, not overall. Yes, there are winners and losers, there are trade-offs here, but overall, that world is cheaper and more effective than the world we have today. And that doesn't even include the damages climate change would cause, which would be infinite cost, essentially, untold trillions at least. So climate solutions can be backed by evidence, and the good news is a lot of them are cheap. And I like cheap. Cheap means you can do a lot of it, and you don't have to argue. So climate science has done a first step, is it helped identify the what of climate solutions, like what works, what does it cost? But now we need help to figure out the how. How do we do it? Over time, geography, in what ways, and what portfolios and co-benefits and so on. And most of the how boils down to this graph here, where the red curve, of course, is greenhouse gas pollution. It's a big number. It's about 60 billion tons of CO2, methane, and N2O equivalent gases. And it had been going up for decades. Well, if we keep doing that, we're really screwed. It goes from bad to worse. And we want to do the opposite. We need to bend the curve and bend it fast, as you all know, cut emissions drastically in the next decade or two, and cut them as close to zero by mid-century as we possibly can. But we acknowledge that we might not be able to cut all emissions in every economic activity everywhere in the world in a voluntary way by mid-century, even with the best of goals in mind. We're going to have some emissions left. And that's where the green curve comes in, the idea of carbon removal. And the hope is carbon removal could maybe grow to the billions of tons scale and absorb that last little bit of pollution. But here's the problem with carbon removal. It doesn't actually exist right now. It's a fantasy. We're talking about it a lot. It gets lots of hype, whether it's trees or soils or machines, but they're absorbing thousands of tons, even in the biggest projects you could possibly name right now, compared to billions, tens of billions of tons going into the atmosphere each and every year. So even a million-fold scale up would still not be visible on this graph. So carbon removal has a huge uphill battle before it's really going to do the job of addressing our emissions. So most of the job is going to be cutting emissions. Don't be fooled by carbon removal saving us. Mostly we have to cut emissions and cut them fast and grow some carbon removal over the next 3 decades. So this is really important. The thing we have to learn, though, about climate change is that it's a cumulative problem. It's something we often forget. The temperatures we saw this year aren't because of this year's emissions. They're because of the last 150 years of emissions building up, thickening the greenhouse layers of the atmosphere, right? So that's also true for the future. That if we want to avert the worst of climate change, it's our cumulative actions that matter, not the actions at any particular year or deadline like 2050 or 2030. It's the total sum of what we do. The area under the curve is what matters, not the value on the curve itself. So if I cut emissions this decade like this, we prevented that much area in blue from ever being emitted into the atmosphere. The good news is early actions we take to cut emissions keep paying off decade after decade into the future. Early actions allow for a very large cumulative impact of climate impacts. So this is good news. We cut emissions today, you get like 30 years of impact between now and the mid 2050s, instead of waiting until 2049 when you get very little impact. So early action matters most. We can keep cutting emissions again the next decade and the decade after that, but the longer you wait for a climate solution, the less helpful it is. In fact, you can do the math on this. There's a discount rate for every year you wait to deploy a climate solution. It loses its cumulative effectiveness of about 7% a year compounding, okay? So keep waiting for fusion, keep waiting for those magic new devices, and you're gonna have less and less impact. Now is better than new. Time is more important than tech every single time. Carbon removal will still be important, but it faces a very big uphill battle because it's at zero now, or round off area. You can't even observe it in the atmosphere. It'll take a lot of work to get to a gigaton scale, and then only have a little time of accumulation of total impact between now and getting to net zero. So when you do the math properly, you do the integral, the area under the curve, you find out emissions cuts are almost the whole answer, 96% of the answer. Most of it in this scenario would be cutting emissions in this first coming decade would be 3/4 of the answer. Carbon removal about 4% of the total answer. So don't look at the end of the curve, look at the total area under the curve. That's what the atmosphere is feeling, is the cumulative emissions change, not 1 year's. So this gives us an idea of the time value of carbon. You've all heard about the time value of money, right? If you're trying to save for retirement, you don't wait till you're 64 and put money in the bank. You should start in your 20s and 30s and build up more impact over time. Same thing with carbon in this kind of scenario. It's the integral, not the value that matters. So when you do that, I like to think about climate solutions with respect to time. And I emphasize a lot what I call emergency brake climate solutions, ones we can implement now and then act on the atmosphere now. Things like stopping deforestation, an immediate impact on the atmosphere, plugging methane leaks, immediate and disproportionately fast climate solution, or efficiencies in today's energy and food systems, not waiting to build tomorrow's. What are the other emergency brakes that we can hit today to stop the climate change from getting much worse and bend the curve a little bit, while other solutions that will take longer to kick in have a little time to unfold? Whether it's infrastructure, we're going to build new everything, new industries, new power systems, new agriculture, new buildings, but it takes time to plan, permit, and finance new infrastructure. Allow for a little. Or nature-based solutions. I love planting trees and rebuilding soils, but it takes decades for them to grow up and accumulate carbon. Planting a tree today has full effect in the atmosphere, what, 3 to 5 decades from now, versus keeping a tree from burning today is immediate. Time asymmetry matters a lot when it comes to nature-based solutions. Stopping the destruction of nature has a much bigger impact than restoring it, but we need to do both. And of course, new technologies, 99% of new technologies don't work, never come to market, ever. So how many will actually make it through, and how long will it take to get to the scale we need? Allow for that time. But that's why we need to emphasize these emergency brake, kind of ready to grow climate solutions need to be the biggest part of our portfolios, because they can bend the curve now, accumulate the largest impact, and allow a little bit of leeway for other slower solutions. So time is so critical here. We also have to pinpoint where to act, because there is a geographic strategy here. When we look, for example, at big data, pinpointing where emissions are coming from, this is using a satellite detecting methane leaks from outer space. We're going to get much better data like this in the next 2 to 3 years, but already we can kind of pinpoint refineries. We can pinpoint leaking oil, gas wells, or coal mines that are just spewing methane out of the atmosphere, or leaking pipelines. We can pinpoint them to the actual facility and name the owner. And we can go there and just say, hey, clean this up. I brought a wrench. Let's figure it out. Stop. These are getting so good now, you can actually see individual feedlots too. So you're going to start to see at the farm level pretty soon methane emissions, which is going to be very, very interesting. So I think this kind of big data can help us geographically target our work to the most impactful, kind of lowest hanging fruit, looking for those 80-20 rules where we can work on 20% of the system that might have 80% of the overall impact. They're everywhere in climate solutions, thanks to big data geospatial analysis and things that we can do now with the help of good science. So geographically targeting our work will help a lot. We also have to embrace learning curves because some climate solutions are going to get better, cheaper, and faster over time, and some won't. Think of like, the iPhones or electronics. These things get better and better and better and, at unbelievable breakneck speeds. So why don't we bet on solutions that can do that? What we found though is that when you look through the meta-analysis, you look at the literature, climate solutions that tend to be big, lumpy solutions, usually big factories or big nuclear power plants or carbon capture plants that are billions of dollars at a time. They don't learn very quickly. They tend to be very expensive, very slow, often over budget and off schedule. And some, like nuclear power, have gotten more expensive with time. Compare that to small, modular, granular technologies where you do them by the millions, like solar panels, like LED lighting, like batteries, heat pumps, EVs. They're getting cheaper, faster, better than anybody ever predicted. Solar keeps beating the forecast of how cheap it can possibly get. Even the biggest optimists are often surprised how cheap solar is getting. Lithium-ion batteries now no longer need cobalt at all, which is kind of great news for mining and other things. And they've also gotten 40% cheaper than they were in January. Okay, that's how fast this is moving, folks. So small, kind of granular things you can do by the millions, that's good. Big, lumpy concrete solutions, not so good. So how do we focus on granular solutions and have the steepest, fastest kind of cost curves going down, the steepest learning curves? That's what we need to focus a lot more on. And of course, we need to focus on climate solutions that are also centered on questions of equity. How we help address human well-being at the same time we think about addressing greenhouse gases. Well, wow, think about all the opportunities we have to do that. I mean, fossil fuels not only are the biggest culprit in causing climate change, they're also one of the biggest sources of air pollution and human kind of suffering around the world. Harvard epidemiologist a couple years ago published a study showing that about 9 million premature deaths a year are caused by the fossil fuel air pollution, not greenhouse gases, but particulates and smog, from air pollution linked to fossil fuels, causing 9 million premature deaths a year. That's more than smoking, guns, and warfare combined. Okay, that's incredible. So we phase out fossil fuels from climate change will help address a big part of the climate crisis. We also probably have the single biggest improvement in human health in decades, especially amongst the most vulnerable and poorest communities in the world, who are the ones who get hammered with this almost everywhere in the world. So we need to think about that very carefully. We can also look more proactively at climate solutions on the left. This is analysis we did at Project Drawdown. These are climate solutions on the left applied in countries where incomes are under $2 a day, places still in a lot of extreme poverty, and asking how could these climate solutions help the atmosphere, but also maybe unlock opportunities for people living in extreme poverty, increasing food security, income and work, water, and so on. There are numerous, we found like 35 different opportunities here for at least possible win-wins between climate and human well-being. Not guaranteed. We could still get it wrong. We could screw up and make things worse. Absolutely. But there are at least opportunities to get things right and improve climate and human well-being at the same time. And make sure the climate solutions are beneficial. Make sure we have a Hippocratic oath for climate. First, do no harm. And second, can we do some good beyond just addressing greenhouse gases? That would be really fantastic if we can do that. And finally, science can help us align all the different things we have to do. We can't rely on a silver bullet for climate change. We're going to do hundreds of different things all over the world at different times in different sectors simultaneously. How do we balance that all out in a portfolio? Well, we might want to use science to kind of guide us on what needs to happen. This is the graph of what the, that curve going towards net zero basically looks like. It says we have to cut emissions in electricity and food, industry, transport, buildings, other emissions, some indirect ways of cutting emissions, and carbon removal at 4%. This is kind of a map of the carbon we have to address between now and mid-century to stop climate change within the Paris Accords. This is what we have to do. But this is where the money is going. It's not going there at all. This is where philanthropy is going, for example. A lot more in carbon removal than I'd bother with, but not nearly enough in other energy emissions, and certainly not enough in industrial. Venture capitalists, the Elon Musk of the world, they put about $90 billion a year in 2/3 of it went into just one technology, electric cars and the little scooters that zip around. 2/3 of their whole money went into what's about a 5% climate solution. We still need EVs, we need scooters, absolutely. But I wouldn't put 2/3 of my budget into that. That's kind of crazy. But it makes sense if you're a venture capitalist because it's a quick exit, quick bucks, and that's what Elon did. So I'm going to do it too. The federal governments of the world are doing what they do. This is the US's Inflation Reduction Act, heavily weighted towards electricity right now, which kind of makes sense if you look at it as a snapshot in time, saying, okay, we clean up the electrical grid first. That enables more solutions in buildings, EVs, transportation industry, and elsewhere later by cleaning and improving the electrical grid. Okay, but you can't keep it like this forever because that's not where the emissions are. Can we align capital with carbon and actually put our money where the problem is? Well, it would be good to do that, and science can help guide us. And not just money, effort, people, activism, everything. Can we just keep an eye on the prize? Like, what do we have to do between now and 2050 and have just a bit of a North Star to guide us on that journey? Absolutely, we can. So these kind of pillars of climate action that maybe science could help us with include these. Make sure what we're doing is backed by good evidence. Make sure that we can focus on the cheap things when we can, or drive down the cost of things that aren't. Let's make sure they're ready to go. Don't wait for solutions because it's cumulative impact that matters. Don't wait for Bill Gates and his fusion machines and stuff. That won't help you. If you're trying to win a marathon, it helps to actually start running. You know, don't talk about disrupting the sneaker industry. You're not going to get there. Okay, start running. So that's important. Targeted solutions, put the actions where they're needed, and big data and science can help us find, oh, that's where it would have the biggest impact. Go there first. Sure, let's do that. Maybe focus on granular solutions that get cheaper, faster, better than others. Make sure they're really beneficial, or at least not harmful to people, especially the vulnerable people of the world, with an eye towards equity and justice every time we can think of that, as well as keeping all of these efforts aligned to the ultimate prize, which is fixing and stabilizing the carbon cycle of the atmosphere. So that's kind of what science can maybe help us with. And if we do this, we still have a narrow window of opportunity to pull it off, but only if we follow these kind of guiding principles. And right now, I don't think we are. We're getting distracted by shiny objects. We don't focus in the right time, the right place, or in the right portfolios too much. So I think it's time for science to step up and say, whoa, here's how to get it right. And if we do that, if we stick the landing every single time from now on, if we use every day to maximum impact and use every dollar like never before, we can still just squeak through this and maybe stop the worst of climate change. But if we don't follow these basic ideas, we won't get it right in time. So let's follow the science. But that's not all that we need, of course. Now, I am a scientist, so I think about that stuff the most. But we need a lot more. We need to change the conversation about climate change, I would argue, too. And this comes down to, in my mind, it comes down to the idea of dreams. We have right now instead nightmares. We have a lot of nightmares about climate change because we're being told them every day. We're stuck in a nightmare because people are making money off of telling them to us every day. Our media ecosystems, our politicians, even activists, are often skewed towards telling us the worst possible stories and polarizing us in the most way possible. And I'm from the US, where it's 10 times, you guys are so nice up here. I was watching your news and they're having respectful debates in the Canadian Parliament. I'm like, who are you people? What's wrong with you? Like, why are you shouting? And it was like amazing. You know, like, wow, this is fantastic. But where I come from, like, we're in this nightmare of polarization and hatred, and fear is dominating everything. And people are making billions of dollars on it, whether it's Twitter, cable news, or politicians. And this is where we're stuck. Now, tell me if this sounds familiar. This is a narrative I think we're hearing about climate change and many other issues, is that we're hopelessly divided and there's no bridging this chasm. And often we're told this, that the world is going to hell. And those bad people over there, they're the ones to blame for it. And if we just get angry enough and you do what I tell you, we can beat those bad guys. Does that sound familiar to any of you by any chance? Yeah, pick an issue, and any side. I would argue this is kind of the, at least in the US, probably a little bit here, is the dominant narrative of everything lately. And it's not helping us. And in fact, it's not even true. On climate change, this is materially demonstrably false. We're actually not divided on this issue really at all. Let me show you the data. This is US based, but it's very similar in Canada. It turns out 90% of Americans actually do believe climate change is real, between 90 and 92%. Okay, 8 to 10% are stubbornly thinking, no, this is all a big hoax, it's a fantasy, like whatever. It's the same people who don't think the earth is round. And they can have their tinfoil hats and be happy, it's fine. I'll take the 90% and take the win and keep moving. You no longer need to convince people climate change is real. You also do not need to focus on how scary it is. They already know. 60% of Americans and Canadians do believe that is also not only true, it's alarming and concerning. So you 90% agree with you, 60% are freaked out with you. You take the win, please. Stop beating people over the head with this. It doesn't help. You already won them over years ago. That's not where the disconnect is. It's actually somewhere else. The real division here isn't about people who believe in climate change and those who don't. It's about what motivates you in other arenas. Most people believe climate change is real. But in the US, and I think it's true here, if you ask ordinary Americans, like, hey, what are the top issues facing you and the country? None of them, well, only 2% will list climate change as a top 5 issue facing them or the nation. But you know what it does? Jobs, cost of living, crime, safety, health, communities, equity, justice. Well, guess what? Climate change touches all of those things, either badly if climate change gets worse, or maybe positively if we use climate solutions. Turns out climate solutions create jobs. They lower the cost of living. They can make communities healthier and more equitable and with more justice and with more security if we do it right. So don't talk to people about abstractions like climate change. That's not where their head's at. They might believe you, they might be scared with you, but it's not a top 5 issue for them. Something else is. Why don't we meet them where they are? Instead of trying to convert the other 98% of the population to be like us as climate activists, how about we get off our asses and go meet the other 98% and ask them what they want and ask how we can help them? That's good communication. Listen, then offer to help. The other thing we find is a lot of people are disengaged. They might be afraid of climate change. They believe in climate change, but they're not sure how to connect it to their daily lives, but they still feel, oh God, I'm already out of time. Okay, let me give a couple more. I'm sorry, I didn't even see that until just now. Okay, let me just wrap up then by saying we need to kind of stop making people scared and make people feel engaged by meeting people where they are. So I want to shift the conversation a bit more from just problems to offering solutions. And if a doctor walks into the waiting room and says, wow, you're sick, man, you're gonna die, I'm out of here, you'd fire that doctor, right? But that's what we're doing on climate change. We're saying, oh my God, it's so terrible, but nothing we can do. Like, yes, there is. There's a hell of a lot we can do. So let's talk about solutions. Let's meet people where they are and talk in terms they care about. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about equity. Let's talk about communities. Let's talk about health. Let's talk about things people care about. And finally, show a better future as possible. People are powered by dreams, not nightmares. Martin Luther King didn't go around the world saying, I have a nightmare. About dreams. Show me a vision of a better world and invite us all to try to build it with him. Maybe we could do something like that and learn from him on climate. Maybe offering this narrative instead. The world is beautiful, but it needs help to stay that way. We do actually have solutions, but we can only get them by working together. But if we work together, we can build a better future. So in the last negative minutes here, let me just give you one last thought. We need science. We need better dreams. And finally, I think we need heroes. And I don't mean ones on TV or in the movies or in Parliament. I mean everyday folks like you and me, everybody out there doing their thing, because an incredible world is within reach. We are, in fact, the first generations in history that could even imagine that kind of beautiful world that's out there, a world where we could eliminate poverty. We could eliminate hunger. We could eliminate disease. We could eliminate illiteracy, inequities, injustices. We could have a world that's sustainable and prosperous and beautiful and amazing. We're 1 to 2 generations away from that possibility if we want it. We're the first people in history to be able to utter that sentence. Think about the people before us, the thousands of generations before us that could never have even imagined the privilege we have today to build a better world. It's a privilege, but it's also an obligation to do so, to honor the people who lived and worked and struggled and died so we could be here today. So that incredible world is within reach, and I think we can still find our way there. It's not game over, folks. It's game on. It's the time to step up like never before and fight like hell for a future that not only you deserve, but our ancestors deserve, so we honor them. So with that, I just want to remind you that it's time to be bold. It is time for us to be guided by science, to have big dreams. And if I can borrow from David Bowie, what the hell? We can be heroes, even just for one day. So with that, thank you. Sorry I ran over a couple minutes, but thank you very much. And hopefully we have some time for questions and conversation here. Excellent. Yeah. Mhm.
What are the numbers of big time
Yeah, the question was, how did you do that meta-analysis? The kind of people were involved. It must have taken a lot of time and effort. I'm paraphrasing your question for people online to hear it. Yeah, it did take a lot of time. The first iterations of this work happened before I was actually at this organization. It culminated in a book simply called Drawdown, which came out in 2017 and 18, which is a New York Times bestseller about climate solutions. Go figure. Yeah, it took a lot of work. I hired about 80 graduate students and postdocs around the world as short-term fellows who kind of worked for 6 months. Like, hey, you're an expert on, electrical grids. Could you read every paper ever written and put it into this spreadsheet we've designed to kind of collect your data into a meta-analysis framework that's the same for every single climate solution we looked at? And then we ran kind of simple econometric models and we fit curves through all the data and asked very simple questions. Very, very simple, not fancy methodology, but it took a lot of work and a lot of very interdisciplinary expertise. So there was no one institution that could do it. So we said, let's find smart young people who work for passion and not much money because we didn't have a lot. And but hopefully some people turn them into chapters of their master's theses and things like this too. But now we switched from that model. Now we have a full-time kind of scientific staff that's trying to do the same thing, but with a more full-time staff in the core now, with about 7 or 8 of us now on this organization. So it's a very small team, but we try to punch above our weight. Yeah. Other question? Yes, please.
You talked about that positive framing
Mhm.
versus that negative framing,
Mhm.
and it kind of reminds me a bit. How can you be positive and be like lovely with people who are like how not try that in 2016 and fail?
Well, so the question was, hey, you're framing a very positive, optimistic, fluffy, if I can quote you, perspective on, this kind of thing. Hey, didn't we try this in 2016 in the United States, having like a Hillary Clinton positive view and a Donald Trump negative view? Hey, the negative view is super seductive. It's so easy to tell people the world is going to hell and those people are to blame for it. That's not leadership, that's bullying. I think leadership is pointing out like we are great, but we're in trouble too. And we can be better than this. We can rise to being the best people we are. And I think ultimately that's what will win. That's what usually wins the race in history between the world kind of going to hell and the world getting better. At any given moment, it's a tie. At any given moment, maybe the bad side wins. But I believe to my core that we have to paint a vision of a better future. Otherwise, just give up. Screw it. Go fly in a private jet, eat all the shrimp, whatever, tear down the forest, screw it, we're done. I'm not giving up. I don't want to plant the white flag. And how dare we? Given all the generations before us that couldn't even imagine the privilege and cushion and comfortable lifestyles we have, and we're the ones complaining that we're living in this difficult time. Any generation before us would be like, oh yeah, hold my beer. Come on. Are you kidding me? People who fought fascism, people went through the Depression, people who won the Cold War, people have done incredible things before us. Isn't it our time to do the same? Isn't it time for us to be great ancestors? That's my argument. I might not win it, but I'm gonna go to my grave with that argument. It's like I think we can be better than this. I know we can, and I hope we can inspire others to believe that. I'd really hate for us to go down without even trying. That's my argument. We can't afford to do that. We're not. That's not worthy of us as a people. Yes. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for mentioning. He asked, like, hey, your analyses were talking about 2050, but a lot of UN discussions these days are focusing on 2030. And I actually agree with that. That's one thing I don't like about my presentation right now is it's focused on this kind of distant 2050 point. I was just using that too as an illustration of like, that's maybe when we actually get to a net zero kind of world, a world where we essentially put the brakes on further climate change. So I was using that as kind of a teaching device, but in fact, I think we should shorten the distance in space and in time when we talk about climate change. No more, not even 2030. How about we talk about this year? What are we doing in 2023? What are we doing in 2024? No more kicking the can. What are we doing here in Vancouver in 2023? Don't tell me about 2030 goals or 2040 goals or 2050 goals and global goals. But that's the kind of work we started with, but I think we need to make them more actionable. The science in like the IPCC models and all the scenarios and stuff like this are very abstract, geopolitical, long-term visions of the future. We need those. But most people live in here and now. How do we take that big picture science and drill down to the local and to the today? So I'd go even farther than maybe your question was of saying, yeah, I don't even want to wait till 2030. We need to act with urgency. And that's why I talk about like emergency brake solutions, ones that you can implement immediately. And once you do, they act in the atmosphere almost immediately too. Time is very important. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Maybe that 2050 thing shouldn't be in this show, but I just put it there to illustrate the point of, how we get to net zero, which will probably take that long. But really good question. Thank you. A couple more. How are we done? Here, and then we'll come over here. Yes. Oh, sure. Yeah. Hmm? Mm-hmm. That's a really, really, really big question, bigger than any one institution can kind of answer. And that's something we all need to think about. So the question is more like, how kind of colonialist approaches to science are embedded in, everything that we learn in these kinds of frameworks or any others. I'll just step back and say, look, the world, no one should have a monopoly on wisdom. We do need, I think, Western approaches to science are actually really helpful. They do things other ways of knowing haven't done before, but it's not the only way of knowing things. And so I think we should be humble and recognize that, kind of Western science has its flaws for sure, because people are flawed too. And we've all made mistakes as institutions, as countries, as legacies. So we have to figure out how to do better. I think the first step is being, with humility and approaching the world from different ways of knowing and saying, hey, we can't possibly neglect any source of wisdom in this era. We need all the wisdom we can get. And so if that includes, bringing, indigenous knowledge about nature and solutions and kind of Western engineering and science and other ways of knowing the world, absolutely, yes, please. And our institutions are still lagging in that, how we teach these things, how we think about these things. We're still kind of behind and struggling with that. So yeah, very good question. I wish I had an answer for that. I don't, but I think we all need to think of one. Great, great question. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are a number of questions. The presentation spoke to carbon emissions
Mhm.
as far as I can tell.
Mhm.
A number of people in the chat are a bit broader. What about
Yep.
and the way they live? What about carbon markets? What about political legislative?
Yep. This is, I find this framework to be helpful, maybe to kind of clarify the conversation. In my organization, we've thought a lot about even the language we use for these things. So we've chosen to, and it's a little bit arbitrary, but we've chosen to say a solution is a physical, material thing. It's a technology, it's a practice, it's something that materially, actually, measurably changes the flow of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So a policy isn't a solution, it's a piece of paper. The solution is the solar panel that actually reduced carbon emissions. So solutions are physical things that reduce the burden of greenhouse gases. This other realm you're talking about, we call those accelerators. So we have like a kind of a chessboard. On one axis is the accelerators, including policy change. Yeah, we're going to change the rules of everything. Regulations, policy, and law need to change. Another accelerator would be capital flows, where the money is going, pull it out of fossil fuels and into kind of the next generation of energy and sustainable transition. We're going to move trillions of dollars. We need to change the rules of business, a third accelerator. So there's not just short-term financial goals and shareholder value, but longer-term goals as well. We need to change technologies. We need to change culture and behavior. All these things are accelerators of solutions. So I think of the climate game as kind of a chessboard. On one dimension, we got the levers we pull, like policy, like activism, like technology development, like money, like business rules and everything, all of that. And on the other part of the board is the solar panels, the things in electricity, the kind of physical tools we could deploy, regenerative agriculture, ocean farming, stopping deforestation. So I like to kind of separate those two and think in a kind of multidimensional space. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are really, really important points. And I think one thing I've noticed, I don't know if you have too, we sometimes get in love with one lever, for some reason, policy wonks in Ottawa really think policy is the lever we pull. And people on Wall Street think it's capital. People in Silicon Valley think it's technology. Activists like to think it's culture and activism. And you know what? They're all wrong and they're all right at the same time. And I'll pull any lever I can move. And sometimes by loosening up one, you loosen up a few more. Activism, for example, kind of messing with that lever seems to then make the other ones move a little bit better in the long run, even though at the time it doesn't seem like it. So that's important. All those levers are probably tied together somewhere underneath, and we need to move them all fast. I don't know if that's helpful. Yes, how about there? Make it a good one. That's the last question. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Yeah. That's a really good point. The question was like, hey, when you talk about solutions making sense and with an evidence base, you talk about how effective it is materially for carbon, how scalable it is technologically, how cost effective it is. The question was, how socially acceptable is it, or socially tenable, I would say maybe. Oh, hey, it's easy to substitute a gas-powered car to an EV, but changing consumer behavior or diets or something has a longer cultural friction to change that. That's a really good point. We've not done that. We are putting kind of time scales in each solution, like what are the obstacles in these accelerators and when cultural shifts or political. Often it's about power, not money, or culture, not money, or technology. Technology and money are the easy problems. So we got those first. After that, it's like, now, how do you make it happen? And you're absolutely right. So yeah, that's a very good point. That's very contextual though, to which situation and which place and where you are, I think, and also who you're talking to. Yeah, maybe. That would be a good idea for us to kind of dig into that and look at it a little bit differently. That's a very good point. Right now, yeah, it is a little bit on the back end. We look at it, not in the front. It would definitely change the answers, but then it wouldn't be sufficient. We're not going to get there if we just, well, let's do things that are easy. And okay, I get to quote. Yeah, there are a few easy ones. Yeah, I mean, the best thing about climate change is like about a quarter of the solutions are like, stop doing stupid stuff. Like, why are we throwing a third of the food away in the world? Why are we letting methane leaks pour into the atmosphere while by oil companies buy carbon capture machines and pretend they're doing something on climate change? How about you fix the leaks in your pipeline first? That would be really amazing. And now thanks to publicly available data, we'll be able to pinpoint methane leaks to the well, to the owner in real time within about 2 years. I think that's going to be a game changer on that. So yeah, I don't know. Very good question. A lot more to think about there.
Just about out of time, but
Okay, well, thank you.